Welcome, everybody. Bienvenidos to our roundtable, Jewish Museums and Archives in the Americas, a dialogue. My name is Natasha Zaretsky, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here today on behalf of the Latin American Jewish Studies Association, LAJSA, along with my colleagues and co-organizers, Daniela Goldfine and Dalia Wassner. We also would like to thank Tammy Cohn for her help in organizing and moderating part one of this roundtable that took place last week. And we would also like to thank Adriana Brodsky and Ariana Uberman, the co-presidents of LAJSA, for their support, as well as everyone else on the LAJSA board, many of whom are here with us today as well. So today's event is part two of a roundtable focused on archives and museums with collections dedicated to Latin American Jewish communities. And last week's event, part one, focused on institutions based in Latin America, including museums and archives from Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, and Curaçao. Today, we turn to institutions based in the US and Canada to continue the dialogue, and we will also be joined by Darrell Lockhart and Stephen Silverstein to talk about the Latin American Jewish Studies Journal. And this event forms part of a LAJSA initiative to help support a network for institutions through our organization. And we'd also like to say that we know that there are many more museums and institutions than are appearing today or that appeared last week. And we really see this as a sampling and the first dialogues in what we hope are more opportunities for institutions to connect across the Americas. And a small note about language, LAJSA's official languages are Spanish, Portuguese, and English. Our first session of this two-part roundtable was primarily in Spanish. And for today, because of the content, we will continue mostly in English, but Spanish and Portuguese is also welcome if needed. As a note, we have also disabled the chat during the first part of the program, but we will open it up at the end when we have questions and answers and discussion. And I will now pass it over to Daniela, who will join in welcoming you all and introducing our moderator for today's conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Natasha. I want to say again, I said last week, Natasha has done an amazing work with all of this, Dalia also. So thank you so much for doing this. I think it's an amazing initiative. And talking about Dalia, I have the pleasure to introduce her as our moderator for today. She's the director of Brandeis Initiative on the Jews of the Americas. She is the author of Harbinger of Modernity, Marcos Aguinis and the Democratization of Argentina. She's co-guest editor of the inaugural issue of Latin American Jewish Studies and has published her scholarship in numerous academic journals. Dr. Wassner serves on the boards of directors of the Latin American Jewish Studies Association and the Association for the Social Scientific Study of Jewry, as well as the editorial board of the Shalvi Hyman Encyclopedia of Jewish Women in the Field of Latin America. Dalia?
Wonderful. Thank you for the introduction, Daniela, and it's been such a pleasure also to be on this task force for Latin American Jewish Studies Association to convene these two roundtables. So it's a pleasure to work with the two of you, and we're so excited to be on our second roundtable now, as Natasha introduced, focusing on institutions that are situated in the U.S. and Canada. And to that end, we have participants from 5 different organizations that are joining us to speak about their perspectives on certain questions that we have prepared. And so we will go in the order in which they appear in the program, and I will go ahead and cue everybody. When it's their turn, we'll be starting with the JDC archives. And the questions that I'm posing to our participants to reflect on for just a few minutes are the following. How do you see your role dedicated to Latin American and Caribbean communities, but situated in the US and or Canada? What are the opportunities or challenges that come from being situated in other parts of the Americas, let's say? The second question is, do you see your role affected, if at all, by the fact that Latin American Jews are increasingly mobile? Some latest statistics indicate that 1/4 of every Latin American Jew no longer lives in Latin America. Many of them have come to other parts of the Americas, including the US or Canada. The third question is, does it matter that we in the US and Canada are part of the Americas? Does that connect us or not to these communities that we're serving and studying? And last, the last question is, what do you see as the challenges and opportunities that you face as part of institutions that contain but are not limited to Latin American communities? Many of you are parts of archives, other organizations that maybe contain resources, information on Latin American and Caribbean jewelry, but it's not your entire focus. So if we could start with the JDC archives, I'd love to introduce Abby Lester, the director of the JDC archives, and Isabel Rohr, the deputy director as well. And you can jointly or take turns in answering those questions. I'm delighted to welcome you both.
Great. Thank you, Dalia. And it's good to be here. Thanks for including us. So I'm going to approach the questions from a perspective that may be different from how others will approach them. Basically, I see us as a somewhat unique archives in this setting. In particular, we are a currently functioning humanitarian organization, and we are the organizational archives of that humanitarian organization, which puts us in a slightly different place than a collecting repository. We have a commitment to the organization, and that's our primary responsibility, is to assist the organization. However, being who we are and what the organization has done, which I can share a teeny bit about in a moment, we have material that connects to this subject matter. That's very significant. I'll leave more about the actual material to Isabel, but I will say, so the JDC Archives is the archives of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, and a very long name, so we tend to go by JDC or Joint. And we have been in existence as an organization since 1914. It's essentially what we've always referred to as the American arm of fundraising to support overseas assistance to Jews in need around the world. So we do not function in the United States, but we function everywhere outside of the United States. Over time, we've participated in support in over 90 countries in the world. And pretty much since close to the beginning, we've supported work that's gone on in Latin America. And because of that, we have quite an extensive collection that goes back to really the 20s and includes our work. Now, so I guess I'm thinking about your questions, Dalia, and our role is twofold. I mean, I believe we have a role, and we've recently partnered with you to do other things to foster research in our collections, particularly around Jews in Latin America and the Caribbean. But as an organization that has current work going on in those regions, we serve a slightly different purpose. And so I see the connection to the community, to the Latin American and Caribbean communities, as twofold, not only historical, but also the current work that we're doing. I don't know, Isabel, did you want to talk a little bit more about?
I just want to add a little bit to what Abby is saying. First, I want to thank LAJSA and for inviting us to participate in this roundtable. It's really a pleasure to be with you. I think we have a lot of material on Latin America throughout our collection. I think one of the challenges is that there's a little bit everywhere, and it's sometimes hard for researchers to find what they are looking for. Even though we have a database, a lot of it is digitized, available online, but somewhat difficult to navigate. So we've created a resource guide, which is available on our website. And maybe when someone else is talking, I can share a link to that resource guide specifically on Latin America and the Caribbean, covering the different material we have throughout the collection, whether documents, photos. We have thousands of photos on Latin America. And we also have film clips, historical film clips as well, and a little bit of artifacts. So we have a rich collection. I mean, this year in particular, we've been very interested in promoting the material we have on Latin America and the Caribbean. We just had a workshop with Brandeis, LAJSA, and SSAJ on, I'm going to not get that title right, but it is Jewish communities, Jewish immigrants, local communities, international Jewish organization in 20th century Latin America and the Caribbean. So this was a way for us to see what research has been conducted in the collection, but also to nurture our relationship with the academic community and make sure that people are actually using our collection, are aware of our collection. We also have had a webinar series on Latin America and the Caribbean in the 20th century, where we've presented research that has been conducted in the collection. So I think one of the challenge for us is to make sure that people are aware of what we have in the collection, and particularly non-English speakers. Probably that's where the biggest challenge is. Researchers in Latin America or elsewhere who are not necessarily aware of the collection, it's reaching out to them. And we kind of trying to work on this at the moment.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you both, Isabel and Abby. That's very, very helpful. And we'll have time for questions, of course, at the end. At this point, it's my pleasure to introduce Cristina Chavarria from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And Cristina, if you'd like to address the same questions and focus on the parts that you prefer, that's also fine. So please, we cede the floor to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for this invitation, Dalia and Natasha, and hello to everybody. I just want to apologize beforehand. I'm not in my regular office, and it says that my bandwidth is low. So I hope you can hear me, and I hope there aren't any technical interruptions. Okay, great. You're giving me the thumbs up. That's wonderful. So first of all, just a little bit of background, and you may have received some information, and many of you may have visited the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. We see ourselves, especially through the Rubenstein Institute for Documentation on the Holocaust. We collect records of the Holocaust. We have the collection of record, as we put it, on the Holocaust. And of course, this involves gathering collections from all over the world. So even though we are the official memorial of the United States to this history, we are a global institution in that we collect records, whether they're personal collections, all the way to the records of a particular country in the Holocaust era. So how does this tie into to Latin America and the Caribbean and the communities, and how we see our role in those communities, being that we are in the United States? Our collections have extended to Latin America in that about 20 years ago, we began a very extensive project that has grown over time and is continuing to grow, to collect records from various countries. And they include not only South America, and of course, many of us look at Argentina as probably being at the forefront of a country that has more records because of the size of the Jewish community that has gone there. We have very distinct projects there in Argentina, and that has presented us with some opportunities to work with EVO, their house at the AMIA, to try to digitize records, for example, from the AMIA, especially after the bombing in 1994, to digitize those records and to make them available here. We have also worked with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to digitize certain collections that were not open, and that were private. And once they were declassified in 2011, we have had that opportunity to digitize those records, and many of them you can actually find online. I do want to say that we have also started to work more closely with Mexico and the Center for Jewish Documentation there. We have some projects that we have begun to bring those records here. And by that, I mean to digitize them and make them accessible through our website and through our Chappelle Center. I will say one of the challenges that we have is that we are a Holocaust institution, and so we do not deal with the extensive history of Latin American Jewry. You will only find records from just prior to the Holocaust, the end of World War I, maybe up through the 1950s. Some of the personal collections that we have do go further than the Holocaust era, which we define as 1933 through 1945, but they are not extensive. So the other challenge that I think that we have is that many people don't recognize that we have, and maybe I shouldn't use the word recognize, but they don't realize or they don't know that we have so many collections from various countries in Latin America, not only Argentina, but we have collections from Uruguay, from Chile, from Ecuador, Colombia, Costa Rica, and we are working to also look at some of the archives that we have that are not specifically from Latin America, but that reference Latin America. So we also have a significant collection from the Caribbean, primarily from Sosua, from the Dominican Republic, looking at the outcome of the Evian Conference. We have personal collections from there. We also have several from Cuba, especially dealing with the voyage of the St. Louis. So there are some very unique opportunities to come and to research. But as far as the knowledge that scholars have in general about our collections, it's not very well known. And I'm really hoping that with LAJSA that we can make it better known that the museum does support research on Latin America.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Christina. And it's fantastic because we actually had, as an example, the director of the Jewish Museum, the archives and the CDI-JUM, the institutions of the archives and documents of Mexico City last week on our part one. And so it's so great to just have these just small examples of the ways that we also are collaborating. So that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Christine. And I'll turn now to welcome Catalin Rack, the director of the Association of Jewish Libraries International Initiative. It's a pleasure, Kati, to have you with us, and I invite you to address the questions as well from your perspective.
Thank you, and it's fantastic to be here. So I'm really excited. Being here, I'm actually meeting colleagues and people who share the interest on a scholarly at other levels towards Latin American Jewish histories and cultures. As the chair of the initiative at the Association for Jewish Libraries, I am entrusted to push the organization further, one of its core missions, which is to be an international professional organization. So although I am a librarian who was working with Latin American materials, both print and archival materials, and under this hat, I am working with Latin American professionals or professionals from Latin America too, but also from the US and from all over the world, who deal with Jewish collections. So this is my perspective in this task, and also this is how I come to the questions whether and I think one of the core question to me within the questions, or looking at the questions, whether our Latin American Jewish collections are for Latin American Jews or for Latin Americans, or is for everyone? Is it something that I see as a shared knowledge base or a shared cultural value that as library professionals we ought to push and ensure that there is an awareness of them, that these materials provide as much specific historically and culturally specific information, but also like general they carry general messages or general knowledge base for everyone whom any librarian works for. So even if it's a very general kind of observation, I found in it a lot of truth. I see Latin American Jewish materials as something that I aim to treat on the same level as any other material in any collection, and as part of the AJL, I'm also very aware to what extent our colleagues in Latin America, to a large extent, are disadvantaged, especially if I compare their position with people who work in libraries and archives in the northern part of the hemisphere. There is a giant gap, and as part of AJL, but also as a librarian in an academic library in the US, I think it's our duty, if not toward our colleagues, but toward these very materials, to help our colleagues. So I think, for instance, what we just heard, the Holocaust Museum collaborating with the Mexican Center, it's an extremely important step, not only towards making materials accessible, but also as a step toward cultural preservation, and also on the meta level. Cultural preservation does not only include the treatment of materials, but also the information and the scholarship that is built on those materials. So I think so this is my kind of long way of saying to what extent I see the question of Americas, or the question of professional exchange, or the question of preservation, accessibility, and the discoverability of materials as a multi-layered scholarly versus activist versus librarian professional question. I think it's a very complex kind of good problem, a very good problem, excellent problem to have all these materials and to dedicate time to them. And lastly, the challenges and opportunities that not only Latin American materials we are treating as library professionals or as professionals dealing with collections that contain materials pertaining to Jewish cultures and histories. I think that's the most important kind of element to recognize, that these materials correlate. Latin American Jewish materials, as they are as much local and specific as global and transnational, at least in my experience. I really like to look at book collections and to realize that Jews in the 19th and 20th century were reading the very same books, maybe in different languages, the same romance novels and the same Bildungsroman all over the world. It's really nice to see Leon Feuchtwanger in Russian, German, English, and Spanish. Yeah, so I think that's my very short kind of thoughts about the questions.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gati. And now we'll turn to our two representatives from archives situated in Canada. First, I'd love to welcome Janice Rosen, the Archives Director of the Alex Dworkin Canadian Jewish Archive. So Janice, we'll turn our attention to you now.
Thank you. Well, my approach to the questions that you posed is as an archivist. So I'll be focusing on the relevant archival collections that we have here and how they're used or how they could be used by Canadians and Latin Americans and the world. The collecting mandate of the Alex Dworkin Canadian Jewish Archives is material relating to Jewish life in Canada and Quebec. So my first reaction to the present topic was that I had nothing to say. But then I thought back to how in 2020, I helped Zachary Baker, who some of you may know, probably most of you know as the former archivist at YIVO and a librarian at YIVO and the emeritus Judaica librarian at Stanford, who was researching an interesting story involving an Argentinian expatriate in the early 20th century. And then I started looking for other mentions of Latin American Jews, and I realized we really do have quite a lot. But what characterizes all this material is that it's about the connections between Canadian and Latin American Jews. With very few exceptions, these collections have hardly been used, probably because they've hardly been publicized. And similarly, few Jews from South and Central American countries have come to this archives pursuing research projects on these subjects. However, thanks to events like this panel, I think the situation is due to change. So the Latin America related materials at the Canadian Jewish Archives really come from 4 collections, and I will now briefly describe and illustrate them. I've provided a document to the organizers, and apparently you could link to it through a link in the chat. So you could follow along, or you could go look at it after, or if anyone has trouble doing that, I could email it to whoever would like to see it as a small PDF document. I'll just mention, it's just a very few slides. Okay, so here we go. Well, the main collection that I first thought of with regard to anything to do with Latin America was the Jewish Immigrant Aid Services collection, of which we have over 1,000 boxes, many of which are case files, starting in 1921 and going till 2008. Now, these personal case files are restricted to the persons named or their direct descendants, although scholars can make special application to study them as a group. But I could just tell you from looking at the overview of the case files that we can see that the greatest number of immigrants that we are seeing coming to Canada from Latin America is through Argentina, also Cuba and Brazil, and to a smaller extent, Uruguay, Chile, and Colombia, and slightly smaller than that, Peru, Puerto Rico, Mexico, and Paraguay. Of course, at certain times, certain numbers are more prominent. And now I can't go into detail about cases, of course, that are confidential, but going back to the research that Zachary Baker did when he wrote his article about Leib Malach's Montreal travelogue of 1930, I was able to pull out a file about Leib Malach, who didn't actually immigrate, but he spent some years in Canada. He was an international scholar, a journalist, a poet, a world traveler, a playwright, a Yiddish novelist. He visited Montreal and settled in Toronto for a little while, and then he moved to Europe, where he died in 1936. So I'm able to talk about his case because he's been dead for many, many years. When the file that we have begins in 1929, where a person from JIAS is introducing him to Halifax Jewish community organizer, saying that he wants to introduce him to El Malach, the well-known Jewish poet, dramatist, and writer. He's a citizen of Argentina. He visited all the Jewish settlements in South America, beginning with Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, ending with Cuba and Mexico. And he spent about a year in the United States having a series of lectures on the subject of Jewish life and activities in South America. So once again, here's your connections element, and how he would be speaking in Halifax would be a great cultural event. However, later on in the file, just a year later, in 1930, someone from the New York office of the HIAS, the Hebrew Sheltering and Immigrant Aid Society of America, is writing to the Montreal office of JIAS saying, I hope that you will take drastic measures in the case of Mr. Malak, since it's in my candid opinion that he's a rascal, and as such he should not be shielded from the eyes of the authorities, or for that matter, even from public opinion. And then a picture of Malak's 3 children that he'd left behind in Argentina is included in the file. This is kind of an unusual thing in a JIAS file. And he writes, David Ignatov writes, I also suggest that you take a good look at the 3 children in the enclosed photograph. One must have no conscience at all to leave 3 such beautiful children at God knows whose mercy. So you can see these files can be very interesting. Moving on to the next collection I wanted to draw your attention to is the Jewish Colonization Association. And this would ring a bell, I think, with anyone who studies Latin America, because the Baron de Hirsch funded colonies all over far-flung places, including Canada, including South America. And it was interesting to note that there were connections between the remote colonies of Saskatchewan and Alberta and Canada and the Argentinian colonies. So in our Canadian Colonization Committee records, we see a report on Argentina where various colonies are described with pictures. In my slideshow, I show pictures from the Narcisse Leven colony. And also we see reports about how the conditions were for Argentinian Jews, because obviously the Canadian farmers were interested in this too, seeing how the JCA was treating the farmers in the other colonies. We see the records in Yiddish and in English, and there's some Spanish in the files. And we see a letter from 1929 where alfalfa from Saskatchewan is being shipped to a colony in Argentina in order for them to carry on their work of the colony. So there was actually trade going on between them, and that's as far back as 29. Moving along to and the other collection that I want to discuss is the Canadian Jewish Congress collection, which constitutes about a quarter of all of our records, thousands of boxes. And a large part of the story is told through the efforts of H.M. Kaiserman and others who, right after the war, toured South America on behalf of the Joint Distribution Committee. Kaiserman was a general secretary of Canadian Jewish Congress, but he did this for the JDC. He went to Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Chile, and Mexico over the course of several months. And our records are quite voluminous on his trip. In my little slideshow, I show a flyer from Sao Paulo in Yiddish and in Portuguese, describing how he was going to talk about Polish Jewry. There's a telegram from Bogota in Chile saying how successful his trip had been, and Kaiserman's own handwriting, writing up the history of the Jews of Peru, in which he'd taken an interest. So this was these are records that I don't think anyone has explored. Another big aspect of the Congress story is the aid that Canadian Jewish Congress gave to Cuba starting in 1961, when American aid could no longer go through. And Canadian Jewish Congress took up the challenge and fundraised, and under their Moes Hitten, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, campaign, the wheat money campaign. And they sent Passover supplies. They also sent New Year's supplies. They sent supplies for Sukkot at various times. This went on for over 40 years. It included diplomatic trips by Canadian Jewish Congress representatives to Cuba to see conditions. We have all these reports. We have voluminous correspondence about this back and forth with the Cuban Jewish community, thanking Congress and asking for what they needed. So a very big story. And there are other Canadian Jewish Congress connections with Latin America, which can be researched through, as a starting point, the bulletins that went out weekly from Canadian Jewish Congress to its officers from 1946 to 1980, describing everything they were into. And there were so many notices about Latin America. There was a Latin American group that formed in Toronto, which perhaps will come into what Donna's going to talk about in a moment. There were mentions of the efforts that Canadian Jewish Congress made to protest against anti-Semitic treatment of Jews in Argentina and other places. And finally, the last collection that I would draw your attention to is a private collection of interviews done by Leslie Lutsky for a Jewish radio show here in Montreal called Montreal Jewish Digest. And it included among the 2,500 or so interviews that he did over the course of 20 years, at least 20 of them have to do with Jews speaking about their experiences in South America or Central America as growing up there or having visited there, their experiences or the charitable efforts that were going on or the cultural exchanges. So these interviews and all the other topics I mentioned can be researched first through our website, which we share with 6 other institutions in Canada, the Canadian Jewish Heritage Network. And also there are details that you don't see there. And so one should always contact us directly if one wants to see more, and we'll run computer searches of material that's not yet posted on the website. So I guess that's all I need to say. Thank you.
Tremendous, Janice. I think this is so enriching, and the way that you describe your archives with just these 4 different examples really allow us to see how Canadian Jews and Jews in other places in the Caribbean and Latin America are much more connected than many assume. And these archives would, if people knew more about them, would help us flesh out these stories and also connect to other organizations such as the Joint that you mentioned as just one example. So that's tremendous. Okay. We now turn to welcome Donna Bernardo Ceris, the Managing Director of the Ontario Jewish Archives, who I believe is joining us from Toronto. Okay. Correct. Yes, welcome, Donna. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this opportunity. I think I'm going to echo a little bit of what everybody said on the panel, but just to situate you, first, I will describe a little bit of my institution's history. So the Ontario Jewish Archives, or the OJA as we refer to it, is situated in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. So Ontario is one of the provinces of Canada. So we have a provincial collecting mandate, although a large amount of our material originates in Toronto, which is the largest community, Jewish community in the province and now in the country as well. It's been a site of permanent Jewish settlement since the 1830s, albeit it was quite small in numbers until the late 19th and early 20th century, when Canada began receiving large numbers of Jewish immigrants from Europe. As I mentioned, it's now the largest Jewish population in the country, numbering just over 186,000 people, which I recognize might be small in comparison to some of the larger centers in the United States. So the OJA was formally established in 1973 by a group of dedicated history enthusiasts. And the goals at our founding 50 years ago were quite clear. It was to build and maintain a community-controlled space for the preservation of Ontario's Jewish heritage, much of which at that time was at risk of loss. And this loss was both a physical loss, records being thrown out during this era, but also loss to other collecting institutions in the province who, within a context of a new federal multicultural policy, had begun to aggressively collect within the Jewish community. So the establishment of our archives was also a response to that. Over the years, our mandate has remained pretty consistent with those founding goals. So in reality, our community, in terms of the experiences that we document, is largely a local one. But of course, as many of the panelists have already mentioned, the modern Jewish experience is really confined by geographic boundaries. And so we find, as a diaspora community, our holdings naturally document other locales. And these occur through family relations found within the collections, through individual migration routes that people took to arrive in Canada, or through these personal and professional connections, some of which my colleague Janice has outlined through her collections. our role ultimately is to preserve the totality of the Jewish experience, including those connections and the impact that they have on both the individual and the collective sense of Jewish identity in Ontario. So I would also like to give two small examples from two different collections within our holdings. One is more of a personal collection and one is more organizational. So the first one I want to highlight is that of Herman Baron Bloom. So Herman Baron Bloom was born in 1914 in Lodz, Poland. By the age of 6, Baron Bloom's family had moved to Berlin. He was a tailor by training. And in 1939, he was very lucky to be able to leave Germany. He took a steamer from Marseille to Molendo, Peru. And from there, he went on to La Paz, Bolivia. At the end of 1947, he then migrated to Buenos Aires, Argentina, where he stayed until 1950 when he moved to Canada. His brother Bernard was already living here in Toronto. So his time in South America was quite brief. And we've sort of pieced together his movements based on official documents that we found in other repositories, but also through a photo album, a scrapbook of photographs that he donated to us actually after his death. This photo album came to us. So we actually didn't get a chance to speak with Herman and really piece together his story through his own words. So we're using this scrapbook of photographs to try and understand what his life might have been like in South America during those years. And they include over 400 photographs, some taken in Bolivia and Argentina, photographs of people, members of the local community that Herman would have befriended while he was there, and also pastoral landscapes that he photographed as he moved around these countries. Much of this is unidentified and admittedly unknown to us up here in Canada. Our archivists on staff are not familiar with the South American landscape and the people themselves who would have made up these communities. So there's real opportunity here, I think, for a partnership with other institutions who could help us identify some of these community members, and we in turn could perhaps help them fill in some of the contextual gaps that they may have. The second collection I want to highlight is that of the United Ostrotzer Hilfsverein. This is a local collection that relates to a Landsmannschaft society that was founded in 1924 here in Toronto. And it was comprised of people who had originated from Ostrowiec in Poland. Initially, the society's mission was to provide support to the Ostrotzers who had immigrated to Toronto, offering small loans and medical assistance, helping to foster a sense of community for immigrants in their new country. The society began with 38 members, and by the end of their first decade, membership had grown to 100. While Canadian immigration policies and the outbreak of war slowed down the immigration growth in Toronto, it surged again after the arrival of Holocaust survivors. So post-war, the Ostrotzer Society was very focused on extending relief and aid to refugees and displaced persons camps and to individuals who found themselves in various countries in Europe and also in Israel. In 1946, I think notably to this conversation, the Society organized a landmark conference in Toronto, leading to the formation of the Central Committee of Ostrotzer Hilfsvereinen in North and South America. And Max Hartstone, whose collection this is, and who was the secretary of our local Ostrotzer Aid Society, then served as the new Central Committee's executive secretary. So this collection primarily contains administrative correspondence from a number of these other Ostrotzer societies around the globe, but also notably between South America and Toronto, particularly Argentina. It also contains over 300 personal letters from Holocaust survivors from Ostrowiec, located throughout North and South America and Europe. And ultimately, the materials document the efforts of the committee in collaboration with these societies worldwide to provide assistance and support to these survivors. Most of the letters date from 1946 and 1947. So they offer incredible insight into this immediate post-war experience and the needs of survivors. Many of these individuals made their way to countries other than Canada, including to Latin America. So those letters are also represented in this collection. And much of the interorganizational correspondence is between Max Hartstone and, as I mentioned, his counterpart in Argentina, Mr. Moish Pilmacher, who was the correspondence secretary for the AIDS Society that was in Buenos Aires. So this particular collection has both local and global significance. And of course, by preserving these records, we learn not only about the local effort, but the broader coordinated effort of Jewish communities in North and South America, and the people who are involved in those efforts in their respective communities. So again, with this collection, there's opportunity for partnership with local institutions that can provide further context on who these individuals are and what became of them, and also provide these intellectual linkages between our repositories. Part of the challenge that we have that others have noted is, of course, making these records more discoverable to researchers who don't think of Toronto as a source for studying Latin American Jewish history and culture, which is a reasonable, expectation, I would say. I think the other challenge we have too, just quickly, is looking at our users and the local community that originated from Latin American countries or who claim Latin American ancestry. Looking at our Canadian census, our most recent Canadian census, that number is actually quite small, about 1,890 people. So only about 1% of the overall Jewish population of Toronto. It's not an overly large number, but again, it's also not insignificant. So how are we ensuring that those voices, these differing accounts of Jewish life and of ways of being Jewish, are also represented within our collections, and that they are prioritized for processing and made discoverable? So these are some of the questions that we think through when we are trying to highlight stories that differ from a more hegemonic experience that many people can easily access and understand.
Amazing. Thank you, Donna. That really reflects on how connected, right, the Americas are, and both in terms of, historically, and also if you're noting 1% of your, current Jewish population, that's probably newer migrations, and that's also reflecting trends, right, in the Americas today. So I'm really excited for the question and answer and discussion section. I thank all of the panelists for the roundtable in joining and providing their perspectives. And before we turn over to the conversation piece of today's roundtable, it's my pleasure to welcome Daryl Lockhart and Stephen Silverstein, who are co-editors of the Latin American Jewish Studies Journal, which is the journal of the Latin American Jewish Studies Association. Part of our goal with LAJSA, obviously, in creating a roundtable like this one and as a part of a series, is to support new research and also collaborations, and to make us all aware of each other. And so there's also a role for our journal in helping support this these new kind of academic opportunities. So I turn it over to Daryl and to Stephen. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us as well.
Thank you, Dalia, and good morning, everybody. Yes, so Stephen and I are the co-editors of Latin American Jewish Studies, and as Dalia mentioned, it is the Journal of the Latin American Jewish Studies Association. We are fairly new. We are coming up on our 4th issue now. Previous issues have been kind of built around special topics. It's kind of the way that we're operating right now, although we do accept open papers on any topic at any time. We have a rolling submission policy. So our first issue was kind of on gender identities in Latin American Jewish cultural production. The second issue was an homage issue to one of the past presidents of Latin American Jewish Studies Association, who passed away a couple years ago. The most recent issue is a special issue on migration in Latin America, uprootedness and embeddedness identity in Latin America. The issue that's in production right now is basically has to do with Latin American Jewish women writers and filmmakers. We have in production an open issue coming up after that. Right now, there's a call for proposals out on Jewish Latin American art and artists, and then several other ideas in the making. So that's kind of how the journal has been operating up to now. We would love to have any kind of individual papers or collective papers if anybody's thinking of doing a special issue around Jewish Latin American Jewish archives and libraries in general. We'd be very interested in getting a proposal and disseminating this type of research as well. I know in Latin American Jewish studies we've been more active in trying to incorporate this kind of topic in our international conferences, and this roundtable is a perfect example of that. So I thank Dalia and the other organizers for putting that together. So we're happy to entertain any questions. Stephen, is there anything that I left out? Is there anything that you would like to mention as well? I think Stephen put the link to the journal into the chat, so everybody can have access to that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Daryl. I just want to thank Natasha, Dalia, and Daniela for all the hard work in putting this together. It's been a really awesome couple of panels, and thanks for the invitation. So we're gonna continue the conversation with Natasha, Dalia, and Daniela, and hope to keep the momentum going, to promote your collections, and to hopefully serve as a conduit between scholars and archivists. So we're excited to serve in that capacity. So please share any ideas that you have, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Wonderful. Thank you both, Daryl and Stephen, for being here and for indicating, LAJS is a continuing opportunity, right, to further these types of goals. It's now my pleasure to allow for some time for conversation, discussion. I'm happy to call on people if you raise your hand, or you can just feel free to unmute. And if you have a question to one of the panelists in particular, or just kind of to the group in general, or comment, of course, as Natasha said at the very beginning, these are a select group for initial roundtables that we were able to put together on these dates, but there are others among us in the audience as well, and that will be joining in future opportunities. So we welcome your comments, questions, reflections.
And I will just add that the chat is now open. So if you'd like to put a question or comment in the chat, you're welcome to, or raising your hand and saying it out loud.
Okay, maybe while people gather their thoughts, I'll start with when it sounds like, one of the opportunities, which is always linked to a challenge, is how do people find out, right, about the holdings of these archives. And so we are putting together through this task force of LAJSA, as you saw, this document that we will be sending and we'll be uploading also on the LAJSA website. So that is a way that people can start to identify resources they may not have considered beforehand, because I think that the opportunity to really learn about these existing archives can be a limiting factor for sure. That's interesting. So Roberta Sunfeld wrote in the chat, how many researchers do you have a year to research about Latin America and Brazil? Roberta, are you asking for a particular organization, a particular archive? That's a pretty general question for everyone. Okay, so if anybody in particular knows that there's certain archival activity related to Brazil in particular, or if you know of researchers dedicated to Latin America. I know that Isabel and Abby noticed that there was an uptake in interest, and based on that, we actually hosted together at Brandeis with also LAJSA, Latin American Jewish Studies Association, and ASSJ, a conference to bring these researchers. And so I think just to put in the 2 cents, one idea that came out from when Isabel and Abby presented that I heard was that the interest actually by the researchers also spurred the archives paying more attention to their own holdings and finding ways to make their resources available right to current researchers. So that was kind of a great like dialectic opportunity. But I'll let people answer how much activity you currently have, where we clearly heard there was room for growth.
In the
Well,
case,
oh, go on. I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry. In the case of the JDC archives, it's a bit hard for us to know who is using what and where they're coming from, because our collections is digitized and available remotely. So we might have, I don't know, hundreds of Brazilian scholars using our archives. I doubt it, but it's very hard for us to know exactly who is using it, because it's literally open to the public. There's one exception, which is our 3344 collection, but that collection, the part of that collection that deals with Latin America will also be eventually open to the public very soon. So it's hard to say. We know of one scholar who is with us today who worked on Brazil, Michael Rome, but it's a bit difficult to assess.
Okay,
Hi,
did you want to weigh in?
sure. So at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, at first it was again, going back to what I said earlier, the lack of knowledge that we contain collections from Latin America. But in the last 5 or 6 years, we have had at least one Latin American scholar come per year they've taken part in fellowships, and these fellowships last anywhere from 3 months to about 6 months. Natasha has come and researched. Of course, you had to deal with the pandemic and the challenges of coming. Yael Simon has also come from Mexico. Yossi Goldstein, Lorena Cardona, research in Colombia. We do have a fellow who will be here researching theater from Argentina, coming in the new group of fellows who will be at the museum. We've started to build this up slowly. And again, it's an issue of people maybe not knowing or not being familiar with what we have. So over the last 5 years, it's started to grow slowly, but we encourage you to look at our collections. And my colleague, Krista Hegberg, is here as well. She's going to share a link about the fellowship program that we have, if any of you are interested in applying for a fellowship. Also, too, you can research our collections online. I do want to mention that not all of our collections are accessible online, but we can put you in touch with our colleagues at the Rubenstein Center or the Rubenstein Institute to see what collections are available for research, to go out to our Chappelle Center in Bowie, Maryland, which holds our collections as well. And I just want to say, what is interesting about our collections is that, of course, you can intersect them with other collections that can provide more of the historical context. Like, for example, we have a personal collection, the Blumenstein family collection. And this collection is quite extraordinary because it really ties in the events in Vienna, in Austria, from 1938 on, and all of these major topics of the Holocaust. But what it shows is the intersection on issues of immigration between the United States and Latin America. You know, oftentimes we take a more Eurocentric view. People take a more Eurocentric view in studying the Holocaust and looking at immigration, but looking at the role in the intersection on immigration issues between Latin America and the United States. And a collection like the Blumenstein family collection does that, because this is a family that was impacted by the Anschluss. The family business was Aryanized. The father was arrested during Kristallnacht, and he was released only on the condition that he would leave the Third Reich. He was on the boat, the Königstein, that was supposed to go to Trinidad and Tobago. It was refused entry, and it was given, the passengers were given temporary refuge in Venezuela. We have the Glick family collection that, or the David Glick collection, which we worked with the JDC to attain that collection, which provides more of the context behind the Königstein passengers receiving refuge, temporary refuge in Venezuela due to a Sephardic Jewish family in Venezuela that had ties with the president of Venezuela at the time. And the Blumenstein, the father, the husband, Franz, he was able to stay in Venezuela for a while, and then he was able to go to Cuba because his sister had already been given refuge there. He was able to secure passage for his wife and son on the St. Louis. They were, of course, turned away. And he goes then to the Dominican Republic. So that's what a lot of our collections have, are these intersections between these different histories. And this is what we need scholars to come to the museum to research. I will, just say this: we don't have enough academics and scholars and researchers coming to see exactly what we have in our archives. Our archives are very rich, but we really want to encourage you to look at the fellowships that we have, also the workshops that we have, and just to really stay in touch with us, because we want to develop more programs, hopefully related to Latin America.
Fantastic, thank you, Christina. And that leads me to a couple of ideas that I'll use my position as moderator to mention as we wrap up. But we do have another question of if anybody can answer if their archives have particular information on Jews from Peru or Jews in Peru.
I know of one collection that we have. I have not had the opportunity to look through it, but I do want to mention, and again, even if they're not specifically from Latin America, we have the ITS, the International Tracing Service records, and there's a lot of reference to Peru, post-war refuge in Peru and other countries from Latin America. So again, you can search the collections, and Krista has put in the link, and see what we have from Peru.
Thank you, Christina. And I'll pass over to Natasha. I see your hand raised, Latin American Jewish Studies Association.
Thank you so much. I'm Natasha Zaretsky. I'm here on behalf of the Latin American Jewish Studies Association, along with my other co-organizers and colleagues. And I just had a question because the word connection and intersection kept on coming up, thinking about what Christina was saying, and also thinking about what Donna said about just incorporating more voices and kind of challenging certain hegemonic or maybe monolithic understandings of what the Jewish experience might be. And I guess my question is having to do with the Spanish language materials that you have in your collections. And I know that might be a challenge for English speakers who don't know Spanish, specific to the places where everyone is situated. But I'm also wondering about the opportunity that might present to Spanish speakers in our different communities, and how you might see the possibility of these Spanish language materials as actually being a bridge to make new connections and to raise awareness about the many complexities and diversities within the Jewish experience in Latin America.
interestingly, the collection that I spoke about, the Ostrotzer Hilfsverein collection, even though there is a lot of communication between North and South America, it's all in Yiddish. So we do find that a lot of the material, although the content relates to South America, the language is actually Yiddish, not exclusively, but predominantly. The one exception would be a collection we have related to a family that immigrated to Mexico in the 1920s. And there's letters back and forth to family members, and that contains both Yiddish and Spanish materials. So for us, language is certainly, like other barriers to access. Language is definitely a predominant one. And we try and translate as best we can. The Ostrotzer Hilfsverein collection is completely translated, for instance, and that gains us access to the information that's contained in these letters, and helps researchers as well. Of course, the originals are there to look at should they want to look at the original or read the original Yiddish and fact check our translations, of course. But for Spanish, I think it's a little bit easier because there are more Spanish speakers out there. So for us, it's about gaining access in order to describe it accurately so that it is accessible and discoverable, and then leaving it to researchers to really delve into the materials and utilize it in the ways that they wish.
Thank you, Donna. Yes, Janice.
I echo the observation that Yiddish really is the bridge to understanding a lot of our Latin American records, because there is a lot of Yiddish in those records. But also our researchers who want to study this area tend to know the language of the area. So as long as we know there is material, they will probably make their way through the Spanish and Portuguese that they find. And we're always on the lookout for student interns to take on projects where, if we know they have a language specialization, they may not be Jewish students, but they may be Spanish speaking students, for example. We take advantage of those opportunities to get some insight into collections which we don't have the language skills to really get into the depths of.
One of the things that we do at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum is we make available for anybody visiting our website, our Holocaust Encyclopedia, which has over 1,000 articles, and it's now all translated in Spanish. And we're working to translate some of the modules that we have developed, for example, for some of the work that we do with military and leadership programs. Those are now being translated to Spanish. In fact, we just received a batch of those. So we're also trying to work in areas, in cities, especially where you do have large Spanish-speaking populations. I just want to say one of the things that we've done is we had a public program, Krista Hegberg, who's here in the webinar, and I helped to work on this. Looking at cities like Miami, for example, to collect from the large Latin American Jewish population that is there. And I know that was one of the questions that we talked about opportunities, and seeing that, Latin America, the growth of the Latin American Jewish population here in the United States, and to try to recognize opportunities there, to share with them what we have and also to collect from them. One of our archivists went to the program that we held at the Miami Beach JCC and received a lot of leads from the community who had connections to the Holocaust. But we aren't translating collections per se, but we are translating general information that will provide more context around the collections.
If I may add one more thing to one more thought,
please. Yes.
Is that when we are speaking about Spanish speakers, obviously we are speaking about Spanish speakers who are living in the North, like either Canada or the US, or actually scholars who are living in Latin America or Spain or wherever, and I'm talking with my hat, AJL hat on my head. It's very important for the professionals to have a network. So this meeting is so wonderful to bring together library professionals and scholars. But and this is how I see how AJL can be a partner in this effort to bring together professionals, because it's very important for a librarian to know what type of collections are available either in Latin America. How can we trace a story, for instance, of a family that we have the resources in one archive or in one library, and then they move to another place and they produce papers that go into another collection, and then it's not only language but also access. And another thought that we see, or at least I think my colleagues as librarians see, how hard it is for Latin American scholars to travel and to access North American libraries and archives, just to get a visa or just to get the funding to go one place. And it's not always a question of, it's not always, we cannot always solve it with scanning and creating digital copies. Sometimes it requires longer and deeper conversations and more deeply shared knowledge about resources. So I think this is another aspect of this meeting that makes this meeting so important.
Thank you, Kati. Well, this has been tremendous. I'm looking at the time and I know we plan to end by 1:15. So I wanted to thank again all of our panelists for joining today. This is such a informative and rich roundtable, and I hope that we continue with the important opportunities that have been noted today. I would like to mention that Latin American Jewish Studies Association has an international conference every 2 to 3 years, and we've just announced our upcoming conference for July 3rd and 4th of 2025, and there will be an upcoming call for papers. So I invite researchers, scholars who've been on the call, if they have ideas related to this, that when the call for paper comes out, you might want to propose a panel or even send to the listserv ideas to create a panel. You never know who you'll find. And also for the archivists who are with us today, I think that there's really an opportunity to continue this as part of our international conference and let people know what it is that your archives hold, and opportunities such as the ones that you noted today. And the conference will be an in-person conference July 3rd and 4th, and in May it will be online. We'll have an online component as well. So we will be following up to everyone who registered with all of the resources that Natasha Zaretsky has put in the chat today. In addition to the link for joining LAJSA, there's also institutional membership, so the institution can join, and of course also to our journal. And we hope to continue to stay in touch and to, create these fruitful opportunities for further knowledge and conversation. It really opens up your archives and our field to really fruitful collaboration, like I said. So thank you to our panelists, and of course to my task force chairs, Daniela Goldfine and also Natasha Zaretsky. We will be following up, like we said, with an email, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thanks, everyone.